Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to Jen's Books. I hope you've had a fantastic week and welcome to the start of a new one. And I'm hoping I'm going to share some really good recommendations with you in this video where I start talking about the books I've read so far in September. Thank you again for all your comments as well on my previous video about classic 19th century literature, my six from the shelf. It was really interesting actually. Quite a few of you mentioned Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South, which is actually one that I nearly included. I really enjoy that book as well. I think living up in the north of England, it also has a particular resonance, you know, sort of the industrial capital. So yeah, I really enjoyed that. The only bit I didn't enjoy about that, because there's some quite long descriptions, you know, about industry included in there. But generally, I really enjoyed that novel. I think it's a great recommendation. So thank you. And I'm also going to put my hand up and promise that I'm going to read Wuthering Heights before Christmas. So I'm going to reread that. It's a long time since I've read it, and I think you're probably right. I think I probably just read it at the wrong time, and it's one of those ones that maybe I need to revisit now with a different sort of expectation than I had the first time I read it, which is, as I say, you know, a long time ago. So looking forward to reading that. And actually, the first book I've read in September is another classic 19th century novel, and it was kind of the book that made me start thinking about which ones I've read in the past and really enjoyed and which ones I've not enjoyed as much, and that is Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. It was actually the first novel she wrote in 1803, but it wasn't published until after her death, along with Persuasion in 1818. So it was kind of her first and her last novel at the same time in some respects. And I've mentioned in the past that as the Night's Drawing, I'm quite drawn to sort of classic novels, and also I like Gothic novels. And as Northanger Abbey is often kind of sold as a Gothic novel, I thought, yeah, this is the one that I want to give a go. And it's been on my TBR for quite some time. So it's sort of more of a satire of the Gothic, really. When it was written, the Gothic novel was becoming quite popular, and I think Jane Austen's taken that as an inspiration for the story. And we're introduced to Catherine Morland, and she's 17, and we find out quite early on that she's a big fan of Gothic fiction, and she talks about the book she's reading with some of her friends and all the sort of scandalous aspects of Gothic fiction of the time. The first half of the novel is kind of quite classic Jane Austen, really. Lots of misunderstandings. Catherine is taken to Bath by some family friends, Mr. and Mrs. Allen, and they take her there for the season, sort of as a companion, but also to introduce her to society and sort of on the lookout for potential husbands. And there she meets the ravishing Henry Tilney, who is the first man who asks her to dance, and so immediately she's in love with him and wants to marry him, because that's apparently what happens. The Allens also meet some of their friends, the Mrs. Thorpe and her daughters and son, and immediately Catherine becomes fast friends with their daughter Isabella. And it turns out that Isabella's met her brother James in the past as well. But what's quite interesting is Catherine's very naive, and she takes everybody on surface value. But as a reader, I think we get the measure of Isabella quite early on, and her actions aren't really that surprising as the novel goes on. But between her friendship with Isabella and her brother John, and this burgeoning potential relationship with Henry Tilney and a friendship with Henry's sister, there's all sorts of confusions and misunderstandings. But it all leads up to Catherine being asked to come to Northanger Abbey, which is Henry's, is his family home, by Colonel Tilney, who is Henry's father. And she becomes really excited about this because she thinks it's going to be a place full of mysteries and secrets and people locked in rooms and ghosts and mystery and all the stuff that comes with a good Gothic novel. And that's where sort of the satire comes into it. I don't want to give too much away for anybody who hasn't read the book, but it's kind of, I mean, it is your sort of typical Jane Austen in many respects, but that sort of Gothic stuff does come in the second half, and I did really enjoy it. Actually, it's not a very long book as well. Actually, it doesn't take too long to read, but yeah, it's not Sense and Sensibility, but I did really enjoy it. And the second book I wanted to talk about actually is something quite different. I feel like I've kind of done a journey around the UK and Ireland with my reading this month. I've read bits from North Ireland, from Ireland. I've read books based in Scotland. I've read books based in England, and also I'm halfway through a poetry collection based in Wales. So I feel like I've done the kind of a bit of a journey. But I was really, really lucky to go along to a reading from one of my friends and colleagues, Heather Richardson, of her new book called Address for Kathleen. And this is a really interesting project, and it's a sort of a mixture of fact and fiction. It's published by Story Machine Press, and she was doing a reading from this in Belfast at the Linen Hall for part of their Linen Biennial, which was a really, really interesting event that I was lucky to get along to. And basically this started off as a textile project. On the front cover in the back of the book you can see this beautiful dress that Heather's made, and she decided she wanted to kind of memorialise or remember her aunt who she never met through textiles. So she made this linen dress, and then she embroidered it and put handwritten messages and things on there as well. It's really, really stunning, and it was lovely to see that as well. But in the process, she produced much more material, and that's what went into this book. So the story is about Kathleen, who died really sadly at the age of 14 in 1939. At the beginning of the Second World War, she was cycling back in a blackout across the countryside, and unfortunately came off her bike. And the book is told in sort of short snapshots, and a lot of it I think is probably based on family memory and family stories, but there's also a fictionalisation of these people's lives as well. So we have extracts and parts through the eyes of Kathleen herself, but also through her father and her mother. So it's interesting from that point of view. We sort of get their background as well, how they met, and the events that led to them marrying and having a large family of 11 children. And I found it really fascinating from that point of view, of that insight of what their life was like at that period of time, living in this sort of quite small house. It had 2 bedrooms and a room in the middle, and so I found that really interesting, and it feels kind of like a love story to family history in that respect. It was really great, as I say, to see the dress alongside the book that it's produced. But if you think you might be interested in that, and this family sort of growing up in Northern Ireland, it's a sort of a really polyphonic and really intriguing and fascinating insight into the family, and the sort of how the family connected with one another. And I think a really beautiful sort of memorialisation of Kathleen as a young woman. So I really enjoyed that, and as I say, it's always an absolute pleasure to see the author read as well in real life. It makes such a massive difference. So that's definitely a recommendation. The next book I read was on my e-reader, so I'm going to pop a photo in here, and it's one that's been on my to read for some time actually, and that is Poor Things by Alisdair Gray. And at the time when it was published in 1992, it won all sorts of awards, the Whitbread, the Guardian Prize, and it's kind of a rewriting or sort of exploration of Frankenstein. And also the reliability of the narrator and the way that women are viewed. There's so much going on in this book that it's sort of difficult to pick apart without giving too much away, but it's really fascinating. So we get told this whole story about this character called Bella Baxter, and then we get told the whole story again kind of at the end, and it's told through lots of different ways. There are letters, there are first person accounts, but which kind of links into sort of Frankenstein in that sort of sense, in the way it was told as well. But it's all centres around this woman who's about 30, coming up to 30, called Bella Baxter, who was, we're told, rescued. Well, not rescued, she'd died. She'd thrown herself into the river heavily pregnant, and she had been plucked from the river and taken to the morgue, where the venerable Miss Dr. Godwin Baxter took her body and reanimated it. And the story goes that they took the brain from her unborn female child and gave her that brain, and then brought her back to life. And the first part of the book's told through the point of view of Archie Candles, who is Candless, who is her fiance and then later her husband. And he tells us a story about how when he first meets her, how intrigued he is by this beautiful woman who is so simple and sort of straightforward and vivacious. But then she actually she becomes engaged, but then she runs off with another character called Duncan Wedderburn, and we find out the next part of the story as they travel around Europe through his letters, and then we have letters from her. And so, as to say, it's through lots of different means that we're sort of told the story. But yeah, there's so much to sort of take from it. As she starts off as this sort of, as I say, very sort of innocent, almost childlike character, and then develops very rapidly, and it develops a real sense of social conscience. And it's also about sexuality. There's just an awful lot going on, and a lot of it's based in Glasgow as well. So it's one of the reasons I said I've been travelling the UK and Southern Ireland in my reading at the moment. So this is a book that's actually being released as a film this year, with I think it's Emma Stone playing Bella Baxter, and I think it will be a really interesting one. And I can understand why there's a lot of people who really enjoy this book, because there's a lot to think about in it and a lot to take in. It's not a sort of a quick or easy read, I wouldn't say particularly, but it's a fascinating one. And if you're a fan of Frankenstein, you're probably going to quite enjoy this one as well, a sort of a modern retelling, but with a real feminist twist to it. The next book I read was also based in Scotland, and it was an accidental read. So it's O Caledonia by Elspeth Barker. And this is a book that I picked up on my travels in the last couple of weeks. I'd never heard of before. It's the only novel that Elspeth Barker wrote. She was a journalist, so that's what she was mostly known for, but she was also, I think, a tutor in creative writing as well. But it is beautiful. It's a really, really beautiful novel. And I would say, if you're a big fan of We've Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson, or anything like that, sort of gothic, beautifully vivid imagery, sort of just very romanticised descriptions, dark descriptions, I think you'd probably really enjoy it. And it starts off with an amazing hook as well. The character Janet, who the book is about, it starts with her death. We know that she's been found dead at the bottom of the staircase. So I don't think I'm giving away any spoilers there, because that's how the book begins. And it actually says at the back, at the bottom of a great stone staircase, dressed in her mother's black lace evening dress, twisted in murderous death, lies Janet. So ends the 16 years of Janet's short life. And this book then takes you back from the beginning, and it's a story of Janet's childhood, growing up in this sort of crumbling Scottish castle. And she's sort of always kind of at odds or socially awkward throughout the book. And it's about her relationship with her family. It's a sort of coming of age story of how she changes from a child to a young woman. But she's sort of very difficult relationship with her parents. She doesn't fulfill sort of her side of the bargain of how they see a daughter should be. But she's sort of quite rebellious. She lives her life through reading. She's incredibly smart, and she goes off to school and becomes smarter and has a reputation of being very smart, but also quite socially awkward, as I say. But there's lots of dark humour in it. It's just beautifully written, really poetic and full of vivid imagery. And it's a real hidden gem that I'd never come across before. As I say, it says on the front, the best, least known novel of the 20th century. That's what Ali Smith called it. And then there's also a little note from Maggie O'Farrell that says, I once decided to become friends with someone on the sole basis that she named O Caledonia as her favourite book. And I can completely understand why people really, really enjoy this book. As I say, particularly that imagery and this really feisty female character and her relationship with her family. And as I say, there's some quite funny bits in there as well, darkly humorous. But I would definitely recommend this, definitely. And it's one that I think I'm probably going to reread again before too long to see what else I get of it. But it's just a beautiful description throughout of the location, and it has those real gothic vibes to it as well. But yeah, fans of Shirley Jackson, fans of probably Angela Carter as well, I think would probably enjoy this just for that vivid description. But yeah, big thumbs up for that one. The next book I read is one of the book along list. So I'm working my way through that massive stack as well, which I talked about in a previous video. And this is Old God's Time by Sebastian Barry. So this was the one that I already owned before the long list was announced, because I'm a big fan of Sebastian Barry. I really, really, really love his books. And what I find really fascinating about his writing is every book is completely different. You never get two books that are the same. And his last two novels were based in California about cowboys. But now we have this retired detective living near Dublin in South Ireland, and it's a really interesting sort of almost stream of consciousness, telling of his life. And early on, we get hints at tragedies that have happened to him and his family. He's now by himself, and again, he's living sort of in a part of an apartment. It feels like it's sort of they've taken an old castle and they've kind of turned it into apartments, and he lives overlooking the sea, but he's incredibly isolated. He's really by himself, and he's slowly, you get the impression he's not losing his mind, but for the events that he's gone through to get to this moment have caused a real impact on him generally. I'll show you the cover again there, beautiful blue cover as well. So the story is of Tom Kettle, who's the detective. He lives in this apartment overlooking the sea, and we know that he was married to June, and we know that he had a daughter called Winnie and a son called Joe, but we also know that they're not around now, but we don't know what's happened to them until quite close to, well, quite close as the book sort of goes on. And one day there's a knock on his door, and there are two detectives from the Gardas where he used to work, and they ask him to come in because they're reinvestigating an old case, and he sort of immediately knows what that case is about. And this is a book that not everybody's going to feel comfortable reading. It's got some quite challenging material. There's a lot about child abuse, and that's really quite affecting, quite uncomfortable to read about. So if you think that might be a trigger, this might not be a book for you. So they're investigating the death of a priest called Father Thaddeus. And so gradually we sort of get hints and tips of what might have actually happened in that event. And it's another one of those books that's quite slow in the start to take off, but I found the character so engaging. And as I say, this kind of stream of consciousness, his brain sort of bouncing around all the time. And you know immediately these it's potentially not 100% reliable. And there's actually a section where a whole scene takes place, and then he wakes up and, and that hasn't taken place yet. So there are aspects that indicate to us that he's not completely reliable throughout. And there's also a sense of him being haunted, both literally and figuratively, from his past. What I would say is, by the time I got to the end, I finished it off in an airport. And if I hadn't been in the airport, I'd have blubbed my eyes out at the end of this book. It's one of those, it's not you, it's not me, it's you, you're crying. It's really has a real emotional impact, gut punch at the end. And as I say, it's quite sort of slow to begin with, and then the pace picks up really rapidly in the last third of the book. But I really, really enjoyed it. As I say, I've enjoyed all the books I've read by Sebastian Barry. I can understand why he's won so many awards for his writing. But if you think that that's something that would interest you, as I say, it's a very sort of specific way of telling the story, the way his mind bounces around. But I didn't find it difficult to follow. I didn't find it difficult to access. And as I say, by the end, it really drawn me in. And oh gosh, that ending. Yeah, I definitely recommend this. I can imagine this getting onto the shortlist for the Booker, but it'll be interesting to see how it progresses in that. And the last book I read today, well, I didn't read it actually, it was an audiobook. I struggle a bit with audiobooks because it can be a really fantastic way to read or access a story while you're on traveling around places. And I'm occasionally spend a long time waiting for delayed trains or in airports and things. So I love it from that point of view. But I think because I'm such a quick reader, I find it quite frustrating that it takes so long. Some of these audiobooks are hours and hours and hours, where actually if I read it, I'd probably read it in, in just, 3 or 4 days at the max for a longish book. So I find that quite frustrating. And at the moment, I'm actually in the middle of, or well, 2/3 of the way through an audiobook, which I'll talk about later in this month. And I'm also partway through, I think I mentioned, a poetry collection as well. So I've got a couple more things that are already going to roll over into the next month. But this one, I did listen to audio because it's Danny Robbins' Into the Uncanny, and I'll put the video up here. When I knew that I was going on some journeys this week, I got quite excited by the fact that this was coming out. So those of you who don't know, Danny Robbins, he wrote the very successful play 222, A Ghost Story, which I was fortunate enough to go and see with my son last year, and which is now touring. But he also is the writer of a really, really popular podcast on BBC Sounds called Uncanny, and it's just compulsive listening. I'm very skeptical. I don't believe in ghosts. I'll be honest. I don't believe in anything like that. But I think the whole concept is really scary, and I think that the supernatural makes a really good story. And he's brilliant at storytelling, and his podcast is he tells ghost stories from people he's met, and he interviews them, and he talks to skeptics and all sorts of stuff. And the podcast, but the way he builds up the tension in his storytelling is really great. So just when you think you've heard the whole story, so he'll turn around and say, and then things got a lot worse. He really ramps it up. So I really love Uncanny as a podcast, and Into the Uncanny came out. And so I got it as an audiobook because I'm used to hearing his voice and hearing him explaining. So in this book, he talks about new cases that he hasn't covered on his podcast. He talks about poltergeist. He talks about Ouija boards. He talks about hauntings of Roman soldiers and Civil War soldiers and all sorts of things, and a haunted apartment in Rome. So if you enjoy the podcast, or you think that it's sort of the subject matter that might interest you, it's definitely worth a listen. If you think the subject matter might interest you, it's worth listening to the podcast first. I think you'd probably really enjoy it. But it really helped the hours fly by when I was sat in the airport waiting for my delayed plane earlier in the week. So yeah, it's one of those things that it's not going to be for everybody, but I just find him really fun, and he sort of really builds the tension, and he explores things in a way that makes me think about these sorts of phenomenon in a new way. Has he made me a believer? No. But I do love a good ghost story, and particularly this time of year, if you like a ghost story, you're probably going to enjoy the podcast, and you probably would also enjoy the book. So I would recommend it. So those are my 6 books so far. As I say, I've got other things on the boil as well, which I'll share with you in my second September Reads video. But for now, I hope you have a fantastic week. My next video is a book haul. There might be a couple of them coming up, actually. So bad. But have a fantastic week, and I'll speak to you again soon. Take care. Bye.